What is cultural Hegelianism? What is the purpose? What am I? And why are you here watching this video? I will try to answer these questions in broad outline. But first, I would like you to consider the possibility that what has brought you here as of now watching this video is an eternal logical process that you were determined out of eternal logical necessity to stumble upon this video at the precise moment when you did, and you were determined to understand or misunderstand, to watch or stop watching this video. And this view of things may be, I don't know, a first step towards understanding what cultural Hegelianism is. I could define it formally, which is lacking, but to have a broad view is better than to progress aimlessly and blindly. The purpose of cultural Hegelianism is to give birth to spirit, and you will understand that later, to self-actualize God. Another purpose is to rationally conceptualize the totality of being, to produce a totalitarian, rationalist, conceptual speech about the totality of being. And another purpose is to, I don't know if it's possible, to go beyond Hegel. We'll see if that's possible, to go beyond Hegel. But now I will make a broad historical presentation of how cultural Hegelianism has come into being, although strictly speaking, it has never ceased to be, but that's quite speculative thinking. As an empirical individual, my intellectual life really started in 2016 because of a terror attack which shook me emotionally and intellectually in a profound way. Back then, I had a leftist view of the world. I was some sort of communist with an anarcho-primitivo communist, romantic, ecological leftist. I had no knowledge of romanticism, but as I reflect back on it now, it would be kind of a romantic view. Yeah, so I was a radical leftist, but not a liberal leftist. I was very critical of the liberal left, but my main influences were Zizek and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and I had read Kaczynski and a French group of situationists, which are some sort of radical Marxist. So my worldview was very obscure, but I would define myself as some sort of vaguely communist, but not an orthodox communist, a weird communist. And a terrorist attack occurred in France, which produced an enormous emotional and intellectual shock for me, because suddenly my worldview, which I had not consciously produced, which was just the state of my mind, the general ideas that I held about the world, my worldview was unable to explain why it had happened. It reached its limit, and now I would say that it was dialectically replaced by another worldview, but I was confronted by a shock, intellectual, emotional, and I could not understand, and I was forced to reconsider my worldview entirely. And August 2016 is when I started for the first time to read a right-wing author. I was prejudiced against the right. I thought that they were evil, bankers, that they were fanatical capitalists trying to exploit the people, and that the right was exploiting and manipulating. And I had a Marxist view of the right. But I had never read any right-wing author. So for the first time I read a right-wing author, and I realized that it made a lot of sense, and it was not what I thought it would be from the perspective of a Marxist or a leftist, and that I discovered that the right was not against the people, that they were defending the people from their point of view. So my worldview altered and changed completely, and I was led on the path of what is called the red pill in the West. So I became more and more radicalized in my mental outlook on the world. I became a conservative, a libertarian, and I will not go into detail, but I adopted right-wing viewpoints and even far-right viewpoints. And this is a very negative outlook on the world, but from the perspective that I had, it was not me who was negative, it was the world. But I was very radical in my views, intellectual. And in 2017, I started to have a first mystical experience, and it would occur at frequent rate. The more I understood and studied and reflected and meditated and made connections between the various layers of being, the more I had the feeling that my mind and the world were connected. Until in January 2018, I had a first glimpse of what I called the absolute. For me, it was poetry. Uh, I discovered the German poet Novalis, who said that poetry is the absolutely real. And I had a conceptual understanding and an artistic understanding of poetry as being the truth of the cosmos. And this conceptual understanding of the value and the meaning of poetry brought me in a state of transcendence, I would say. And I started to talk about the absolute. And I made a summary, a retroactive look on all the steps which has led me to this view of transcendence in a mystical way. And I brought forward, I objectified the whole process of intellectual and spiritual development that had led me where I was. And there were all the intellectual steps, conservatism, libertarianism, some sort of those sort of things, and all the authors that I had read, the dead authors, but also the living authors, journalists, intellectuals, politicians, thinkers, what I call the figures of consciousness, which are really existing people who make videos on the internet, and people like Stephen Molyneux, Ron Paul. There was the Thulan perspective. I tried to organize my spiritual and intellectual journey and all the steps that I had gone through over the past 18 months broadly. And I thought to myself, it looks like the phenomenology of my own mind, the phenomenal appearance of my own mind, the way my mind appears to me in a form of phenomena. And I was vaguely familiar with Hegel, the German philosopher, from my leftist background, but very vaguely. And when I realized that my intellectual journey was a phenomenal appearance of my own mind, I started to get interested in Hegel because I knew that he wrote a book called The Phenomenology of Spirit. And from this moment onward, January 2018, I became fascinated by Hegel. It was the more I understood Hegel, the more I was absolutely fascinated. This was my greatest intellectual love story. And I will put the link to a song by Rihanna and Eminem, Love the Way You Lie. On the first page of our story, the future seemed so bright, then this thing turned out so evil. I don't know why I'm still surprised. Even angels have their wicked scheme, but you took that to new extremes. But hopefully you'll always be my hero. Um, I will put the link to the song. But my relationship with Hegel started as a, whoa, this is the most brilliant thinker ever, and I was passionately, intellectually in love with Hegel. And in April or May 2018, I started as a joke to think of cultural Hegelianism, because from my perspective, the problems of the West with which I identified came from cultural Marxism. And I said to myself, let's make a joke. I will try to create a set of doctrines which would refute cultural Marxism and draw inspiration from cultural Marxism, but transcend it. And I said to myself, since I have become a Hegelian, I will call this cultural Hegelianism. And in the view that I was starting to take shape and to take form within my mind, it would be during the month of May and June 2018. Cultural Hegelianism, as I envision it, was an attempt to bring about Christ consciousness. I had just been converted to Christianity, but that's a long story. Um, to bring about Christ consciousness, which I partly identified with my love for Europe as a spiritual entity. They were in my mind they were mixed and confused, but anyway. And the way I defined it, cultural Hegelianism, was in the philosophy of Hegel. Hegel says that absolute spirit is made manifest through art, religion, and philosophy. And the way I envision cultural Hegelianism, um, modern pop culture, American pop culture, not only American, but mostly American pop culture, manifests deep truths, deep divine truths. And religion had discovered Julius Evola, and I was starting to understand that he had gathered and systematized all the mystical knowledge from all the religious experiences of mankind in his writings. So my religious view was the view of Julius Evola, the mystical view of Evola, and my philosophical view was Hegel. But I had started to understand that in order for Hegel to be really Hegel, it had to include within itself the post-Hegelian, non-Hegelian philosophers within his system. So the way I started to define cultural Hegelianism in 2018, when the idea burst into my mind, was Avril Lavigne, not only her, but as a symbol of modern pop culture, because I was a huge fan of Avril Lavigne, because she's extremely beautiful and talented, and I love her songs. So it was Avril Lavigne for the artistic part. As a symbol, it was the whole of modern pop culture, but as a symbol, Avril Lavigne, Julius Evola, and Hegel, with the non-Hegelian philosophers included within Hegel, and that would be real cultural Hegelianism, which would be real Hegelianism. And yeah, that was the view. And the purpose was to bring about Christ consciousness. I did not know, did not understood what I was doing. I was driven by passion. Yeah. And in August 2018, after 7 months of being fascinated by Hegel, I had I had a view of God back then of being truth, goodness, and beauty. And I had a divine experience, a mystical insight in the month of August 2018, where I realized that I, as a higher self, I guess, that I had an experience of my higher transcendental ego. I did not understand that back then, but as my transcendental ego as being the cause of all reality, or the condition of possibility of all reality. And I called this God. So I identified with God. And I would later understand that what happened at that moment was the birth of reason. In the Hegelian meaning of the word, the terminology of Hegel means a singular consciousness, an individual consciousness, which becomes aware that the whole of reality is within her consciousness. So yeah, and I started in 2019 to get anxious and panicked because I started to believe that the world was my manifestation. And when I looked at the news and I saw all the conflicts and the death and the tragedies and the horrors, I said to myself, but if my consciousness is one with the world, I am responsible for these dark events. And I started to become anxious and panicked. And I produced videos in 2019 to try to share my knowledge and my view of the world with others, and mostly with the right-wing pagan communities, because they were those with whom I was the most closely connected from a spiritual viewpoint. But I tried to 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 share my knowledge to try to save the world in a way from myself. But yeah, and yeah, and in at the end of 2019, all of a sudden I lost all my beliefs, because this worldview seemed so nonsensical, so crazy, so absurd, so complicated, so weird, that I said to myself, maybe maybe my mystical experiences were some sort of psychological delusion. Maybe I've just hallucinated everything that has happened over the past 2.5 years. The idea that the world is a projection of my mind is completely nonsensical. So out of a sudden, I stopped to believe in everything that I had experienced, and I I started a normal life, trying to be socially integrated, to become a student and a worker, and to adopt a normal life. And until February 2022, where I went to church. That's a comical and dialectical irony that it is the church which enabled to recover my knowledge. And I listened to the spiritual, I don't know how you call it in English. It was a Protestant church, and a woman who made a speech about about God and about Jesus. And I realized that although I had no religious knowledge formally, I understood the meaning of the words because of my philosophical experience. And I was awakened and converted back to my philosophical view. And that's when I started to make videos again. And I now know that what I had believed and knew, not known, what I had known was actually the truth. And I had stopped to believe in the truth. And that's how I started to make videos on this channel over the past month or so. And I am understanding more and more that uh, my role is to to conceptualize the totality of being in all its aspects. Uh, and I made videos to explain that wherever there is a there is separation, and in truth, there is only being, and being is a process which involves negation and differentiation within being. It is a process of self-cognition and self-recognition, and it is a process of uh, producing an encyclopedic knowledge of itself, and this process of being becoming rationally conscious of itself is what we call God, and even the absolute. And yeah, so that's in broad outline how um, I have come to produce this video, and if you are still here watching it, that's how you have come to watch this video. And the purpose of my channel is to actualize God, to make the absolute and God manifest. And in order to produce that, I need to integrate within my mind, the mind of my higher self at least, the totality of being in the process of becoming conscious of itself. And yeah, so cultural Hegelianism is very strange, and it is not necessarily always pleasant, but it's very rich in thought, and in it's very deep, I believe. So this is just a video of introduction so that you might understand what my videos are all about. And yeah, I will produce content on this channel as long as I can, and when I won't be able to anymore, I will find another way to express my thoughts, and I will become famous for better and for worse, and my higher self will become famous, and that's the good aspect. And yeah, so we will see what happens. And yeah.